Hello everyone and welcome to Lecture 5 of Exploring Media Theory. This is the pre-recorded lecture. This week we're going to be looking at how we theorise media in a late modern or postmodern world. So the aims of this lecture are to trace the responses of certain theorists to the development of media in the late 20th century and early 21st century. And we're going to look at two separate sets of theory. First lot of theory we're going to look at are people who believe that this period of time can best be understood as a period of late modernity. It's part of modernity and this is just the latter stages of modernity. We're also going to look at people who, rather than saying this is late modernity, they say this period is really a period after modernity or post-modernity. So what we're going to do is try to look at these two theories. We're going to cover four theorists in detail. And we're going to critically evaluate their approaches. We're going to look at some of the pros and cons of each theory. And we're going to try and relate these ideas to some of the bigger concepts that we introduced in the earlier lectures. Things like structure and agency and whether they're macro or micro theories. One other thing I'm going to try and do this time is use a slightly different form of PowerPoint. So what I've done this time is, rather than having about 20 slides, I've only got about 7. But each slide is much more compact, with a lot more information on there, and I'm spending a lot longer talking about each slide. One of the problems of this, however, I've noticed, is that my face down in the bottom right hand side of your screen might actually block out some of the text. So what I suggest you do is have a look, and if there's bits of it you can't read, then flip over to the proper PowerPoint, which I'll upload to Canvas, and sort of like read through that as well. Hopefully it won't be too bad. And also, can you put in the comments on the bottom of the YouTube clip whether you like this type of presentation or if you'd like me to go back to the older form of presentation. So just let me know whether you think this works better for you or whether it's a disaster and I should go back to my normal way, where I have about 20 to 25 slides and I talk through them quite quickly. So let's have a go. Okay, so what we're going to do today is look at the idea of globalization, and we're going to contrast it with late modern times or whether it's postmodern times. So what do we mean by globalization? Well, globalization really refers to the way in which the world has become a much smaller place, and that seems a bit of a strange thing to say, but essentially we're arguing there's a number of changes have taken place maybe over the past 30 or 40 years, and that has changed really how we experience different parts of the world. So I'm talking about 6 changes here. Now what these do, these place us into what we might term, these changes put us into a latter part of capitalism or modernity. And if you think back to the stuff we did in earlier sessions when we talked about the idea of modernity being a specific period of time, if you remember back, we talked about it really starting from around 1650 and coming right up to the present day. And then we could subdivide modernity into different stages. We've got the early period of modernity from around 1650 to about 1850, where the big things of the modern world are really getting established. And that drew in a lot of ideas that came out of the Renaissance and so on. And then from about 1850 to about 1970, 1950 or 1970, we've got a period of middle modernity. And in that time, the modernist project matured, societies became more advanced, and many of the features that we know today were established. And there was, that's the time of massive ages of bureaucracy, lots of things were going on. You saw the rise of mass education systems, the emergence of the mass media in the world. So lots of things are going on then. Now since 1970, the end of 1970, we've moved maybe into another stage. And some people say this is the age of late modernity or late capitalism. And capitalism, if you remember from the stuff we talked about in Marx, is understood as to be a mode of production, a way in which we can distribute the goods that we need to live in day-to-day life. And there are other systems of dividing these goods. So we've talked about communism, but there's also socialism, and then before capitalism really got started we have feudalism, and then before that you go back in time, and you get the different systems. So capitalism is a system that, though it looks like it's been around forever, it has only really been going for about 350 to 400 years, and its current form of late capitalism has really been going on for about 20. And I'll talk about a few of the ways in which capitalism today is slightly different from how it was. So because it changes, some of the big fixed certainties of our world have also changed too. And the big fixed things that we thought we structured our lives seem to be breaking down. So if you think about it, the idea of getting a job for life, of having big stable communities, all these things are beginning to break down and fracture as we move into this later part of capitalism. So what really causes these things? What causes this globalization? Well, I've identified kind of 6 things here. The first of which is the emergence of new technologies. From about the mid-1980s, we started to get satellite television as a much more common occurrence. These are the dishes that people have on the outside of their houses. Now, what satellite television allows you to do is to receive television channels from different countries. So you can put this TV channel up and you can get American TV, you can get Indian TV, you might get some Nigerian television, Chinese television, all sorts of things. And these are all over the world. So people all over the world can get television channels from other parts. Now, why this is significant is it allows diasporic communities, people that live in another part of the world, to get television from their home countries. So you might have people from the Indian subcontinent in the UK receiving this. You have people from Turkey living in Germany getting Turkish television. You have people from Russia living in America getting Russian television, and so on. And it allows people to have a much closer link to their originating culture or originating country. So it makes the world seem more interconnected. Now, also during the 1980s, of course, we had the birth of the internet. Now, though the internet was really starting about 1969, it didn't really get anywhere. It was primarily a university-based system, and it wasn't until sort of the mid-1980s to late 1980s that it really started to spread. And by the mid-1990s, it was beginning to get some traffic. So I think by about 1995, about 1% of the world's population were online. Now it's about 40% of the world's population is online. And that actually might be even higher. I'll have to check that number. But anyway, so we've seen a massive change in the amount of communication that's going on and the amount of ways in which we can understand the world and get information from other parts of the world. And when you think about it, each and every one of you sitting in a lecture or in any audience really, you have a mobile phone in your pocket, and you can use that to contact people in other countries. And because of technologies such as Facebook, we're far more connected to people in other countries than we ever were before. Only 20 years ago or 25 years ago, if you wanted to make an international phone call, quite often you would have to book it. Many years ago I lived abroad, I lived in Thailand, and to phone back home to my parents in the UK, what I'd have to do is go into a post office and book an international call, and then go back at a set time and you'd sit in the booth and you'd make the international call. Now, we can go anywhere, we can just open up our phone and make these things. Now, we take them for granted, and they alter the way in which we experience the world slightly, make things easier, but also add new levels of complexity onto it. So these new technologies, such as the internet and new telecom systems and satellite television, have changed things quite dramatically. Now also there was quite large international political changes occurring during the 1980s and 1990s. And we've spoken before about how many countries were living under communist regimes. And vast amounts of people. So as you had the USSR, which is what is contemporary Russia, but also that was loads of other countries were within the USSR. So places like Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, many of these smaller republics that are dotted around the edge of the USSR were also part of that country. It was a colonial power in its own right, but it also was dominant in places like Poland, in Hungary, in the Czech Republic, in Romania, in Bulgaria, and in Yugoslavia, and many other smaller countries dotted around the region. And so really there was a very stark divide between people who considered themselves free and living in the West and people who lived under the communist systems of Eastern Europe and Russia. And whether there were actually any more free in the West is debatable. But by about the late 1980s, the economic systems had slowly begun to deteriorate quite strongly in many of these countries, and gradually pressures built up internally to them. And then finally in 1989, part of Eastern Germany, the city of Berlin in Eastern Germany, which was divided between the western part of it and an eastern part of it, there was a wall down the middle. Finally in 1989, the eastern state could no longer sustain its way of living, and the wall was pulled down and people were allowed to move between East and West Berlin. And this really triggered the general collapse of communist regimes in a number of countries. Romania followed, Bulgaria followed quickly after that, and then Russia itself finally shifted away from a communist system towards a more democratic or capitalist framework. So this had an enormous impact, because it was basically half the world were living under this framework, or a third of the world were living under this framework, and then over a period of very few years it shifted and they were no longer living under it. Now within domestic politics as well there were a number of changes. So within the UK, from the end of the Second World War to about 1979, there had been what was called a general consensus, an agreement of how political governance would occur. And there was still the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and they shifted and changed, and at one period it would be the Labour Party and then it would be the Conservative Party and so on. But generally there was a consensus. It was called the Baudrillard consensus, where political parties there was a general framework upon which they would agree. There was the capitalist system, so there was a group of financiers and there were trade unions, and they would all work together. And although there would be lots of disagreements occasionally and there would be strikes and things like that, for the most part they sought to drive things forward. Now by about 1979, this consensus, this agreement was gradually breaking down, and there had been a lot of strikes in the 1970s, there had been more disparity between rich and the poor, and there was more conflict. Thatcher comes in 1979 and brings in a new economic system. She tried a new way of allocating financial resources. It was initially called monetarism, and it's about how you control the amount of money in the economy. And that over a number of years evolved into a system called Thatcherism. Now, in the US as well, a similar change was going on. This occurred from about 1982 onwards, when Ronald Reagan was elected president after Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a Democrat, Reagan comes in and he's a Republican, and he also instigates a number of these changes. He brings in a number of these changes. And what was involved in these changes was a challenge to the strength of trade unions and a freeing up of labour laws, which allowed employers to treat workers in a worse way. Effectively, they were allowed to fire them on a much easier basis, and trade unions didn't have the power. Trade unions were restricted, and this had impacts upon how societies functioned. And what Thatcher also did was slowly phase out the larger heavy industries that predominated in the UK economy. So things like during the 1980s and 1990s, they closed down many of the coal mines, many of the heavy industries that produced, and many of the factories that produced things like steel and shipbuilding were slowly cut away, and in their place a service economy and a more high-tech economy emerged in the UK. And a similar thing happened in the US as well. The older industries of producing heavy goods were gradually slowed down, and a more service-based, a more financial-based and more IT economy emerged. Now, what happened to those jobs in heavy industry? Well, those jobs moved to other parts of the world and moved to more developing countries where labour was cheaper. So this allowed some of the changes in the law, allowed big companies to outsource work to different parts of the world. There were also quite significant changes to how money moved around. In 1986, the British government did something called the Big Bang, and what this effectively did, it deregulated the City of London. So the City of London is the main location for trading. But there's a stock market there, and a lot of financial institutions are based in the City of London. Now they were there beforehand, but nowhere near to the extent they were pre-1986. So what they did, they deregulated and they changed the law. They allowed different people to own, and people to own multiple houses, people to work for different banks and so on. So a number of these changes took place from about 1986, and consequently the City of London grew very much, and it now takes up about 15% of the UK economy is driven by the City of London, the financial instruments that occur there. So those kind of regulations of the financial industry have been going on for a number of time. One of the big changes was 1986. Now another big change is the nature of culture. Now I talked a moment ago about how new technologies had changed things, but as well as the technology changes, the type of culture, and because of the proliferation of TV channels, because of satellite television, and because of the communication facilitated by the internet, new forms of digital culture emerged. MTV was launched in the 1980s, and there's loads of rivals. Multiple channels came about, foreign language channels came about, and there's a vast growth of consumer culture. People are able to sort of like spend more money on their personal lives and then on their consumption of different forms of media. Now another thing when I talked a moment ago about the changes in the international political landscape when communism had finally gone away, well, that also changed how we feel about things. So when we lived under a communist system, when I was growing up, the big threat was nuclear war. We were very scared that the West was going to have a war with Russia, and there would be some catastrophic Armageddon going on, and nuclear bombs would come in. And there used to be TV shows that focused on this. There were public information films shown on this. You were warned about it at school, particularly around 1982, 1983. The Cold War got very, very serious, and we did think there was going to be a nuclear holocaust at some point. Now, once Russia has gone away, and once the nuclear weapons and the Soviet systems have gone away, well, other threats start to become more apparent in people's minds. So with the decline of communism, we've lost our big threat that sort of like gave us our structure and how we think about the world, but instead in this place come things like global warming. The AIDS epidemic was getting going there, a number of other serious diseases, and a number of other financial things were occurring. So there was a proliferation or multiplicity of threats. Lots of smaller but many more threats were occurring. So we lost the big threat of nuclear war, but in its place we've got these different ways of thinking about problems. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So that was the kind of rough situation. So how did theorists try and deal with this? So I want now to look at two particular theorists, Anthony Giddens and John Thompson. And these two conceptualize it as that we live in a period of high or late modernity. So the changes brought about by globalization were understood as the final stage of capitalism. And here they're drawing on some of those ideas from Marx. Giddens was he'd written lots of books about the early sociologists, including Marx, and he did a critical re-evaluation of this. So he did take some of the ideas of Marx about how we're moving on through different phases of history, as I mentioned a few moments ago, when we talk about the period of modernity and coming after, so kind of the Renaissance and the earlier periods of time. And there's the idea that there will be something after modernity. But what Giddens is arguing is that there's this period of modernity and we're living at the end of it, what he terms late or high modernity. So sociologists were interested in how people negotiate the new social structures caused by globalization, and how the changes to the power and power relationships are operating in this new world. So globalization is understood to erode tradition and other sources of certainty, such as faith and our belief in progress. So you might remember a few weeks ago when we talked about mass society theory, Giddens is also articulating not quite the same theory, but we do recognise that in a period of modernity we lose tradition. And one of the big things Giddens talks about is how modern life is de-traditionalised. And in fact it's continued to de-traditionalise as we go on. The more we live in this period, the less traditional our societies go on. But there's other things going on in our world. How we experience space and time are differently when you live in a globalised world as to what you might have lived with 200 years ago. If you think back a couple of hundred years, how long it would take to get a message to the other side of the world. It could take up to 18 months for a ship to sail all the way around. Now, during Middle Modernity, well, we have much quicker ways of doing it. We could, the steam train sped things up a bit, and then finally the invention of the telegraph allowed quicker communication. Now, as I mentioned, you can phone someone on the other side of the world and be in contact instantaneously. So our understanding of world events has changed. We're constantly updated for things that are going on in America or in other countries all over the place. And we have friends the world over. Probably if you open up your Facebook account, you've got people in other countries. And some of our international students will have links all over the world. So how we understand the world is a much smaller place. I don't mean it's physically smaller, but the amount of time and the amount of effort it takes for us to communicate with people is much less. And you can get on a plane and be in Australia within 18 hours now. It would take 6 months previously. So anyway, these sociologists are trying to understand these dramatic changes. The first one we're going to consider is a guy called Anthony Giddens. And Anthony Giddens is a very influential British sociologist whose work has impacted both academic life and political life. He was an advisor to Tony Blair. And some of Giddens's ideas were used directly in government. One of his key ideas was the idea of the third way. And what Giddens argues is that a progressive left government should be in there to improve people's lives. That's what the Labour Party stood for. They're about equalising things and making things better. Now previously the Labour Party had identified itself very much with the public sector and mass systems of employment. And after Thatcher, many of these were much smaller. But what Giddens argues is that it shouldn't identify itself so closely with any particular sector of the economy. Instead, it should use both public and private sector to try and deliver a better system. So it doesn't matter who runs the healthcare system or who runs the education system, as long as it does a good job in delivering health and education. So he brought in under his steer things like PFI, public finance partnerships, were brought in. Now, today we're quite critical of these particular approaches, and it's turned out they're not such a good deal for the government, and the government's ended up paying a lot of money to service these arrangements. But it was interesting that Giddens was actually so powerful and his work was so respected that it was used by politicians to do this. In fact, he was actually known as Tony's Tony for a while, so he was Tony Blair's main advisor. Now, he was a prolific author. He's still alive. He's a prolific author. He's written over 34 books. He also ran the London School of Economics for 6 years as their director. So he's a very successful academic, and he's had an awful lot of impact. And I want to talk about three of his ideas here. First off, we've mentioned over the past couple of weeks the idea of structure and action. Whether social structure, those big things like class and our ideas of gender and things like that, influence how we act as individuals, or do we create the world ourselves? Do we have free action? Do we have free will? Can we do what we want outside of our social class and our constructions and so on like that? So what Giddens tried to do, he tried to solve this problem about whether we're guided more by action or by structure. And he came up with his portmanteau, structuration. So he combined the words of structure and action. It sounds a bit daft, but what he did, he said, so you've got social structures up here, and you've got individual action down here. There is a mid-level, what he called social systems. And social systems are things like not so much traditions, but there are expectations and our understandings of how we should live day-to-day life. So they're the norms we live through. So social systems exist in all sorts of ways. So say, for example, the way in which I speak with students is governed by social systems. The way in which you speak with each other, or the way in which you work in a particular place. All aspects of our social life are governed by social systems. We know what is acceptable and normal to do in particular situations. If you go to a bus stop, there's a social system that you don't jump the queue. And if you do jump the queue, people get cross. And so these social systems exist at all levels. Sorry, not all levels. These social systems exist at a particular level of our life. They're above our individual minds, but they're not quite up there with social structures. Now, what social systems do is that they give us the language through which to live. They give us the ways in which we should behave, and we internalise social systems. We know what we are by our social systems. They allow us to think about things, solve problems, engage with others. They're the governing rules, the little laws that we live by. And what Giddens says is that these social systems are actually enacted social structures. So social structures affect the social systems, and we live through the social systems. So in that way, we're not either structure or action. We've got this mid-level way of thinking about it. So structuration is the way in which we experience and live through the world. Now, following on from that, he also talks about the idea of self-identity. And he says that in late modernity, tradition plays a far lesser role in our identity than it did previously. So now we were much freer to do things. Instead, in late modernity, institutions take the role of traditions. So institutions like schools, colleges, marriage, our relationships with other people, they give us what is normal to live in our lives. We don't depend purely on tradition anymore. And many of these institutions are formalised and have they're written into law, or they're written into other forms of social practice. And they impact upon our lives. So if you go back 500 years, our way of living was governed primarily by tradition. What you should do is what had been done in your society for many years. But in late modern life, the place of tradition has been taken by institutions, and these penetrate into our lives and give us the ways in which we should do it. But also in place of tradition, we've become we understood to be more in charge of our own destiny. And that's kind of like a narrative that we live through in our day-to-day lives. I'll give you an example. So if you walk into a bookshop and you have a look around the books, you'll find lots of books on, I don't know, like guidance books, or how to have a diet, how to have a successful romance, how to start your own business. You are put at the centre, and you are empowered to do things. And you've got this terrible phrase, YOLO, you only live once, or live your life. So there's all these ideas that somehow we're in charge of our lives. And that's different to how we lived under traditional societies, where we lived according to a set of social systems much more. Here, we're supposed to be in charge of things. So our identities become a project. We can steer ourselves, we can take on different ideas, and we can build up our own way of doing things. So our identities become the system via which we plan and live our lives. And in late modernity, we're much more responsible for doing this. Now, another thing I talked about a few moments ago, let's go back a second. So when I was talking about the new threats that emerge, well, Giddens also talks about risk in late modernity. And he says this is different, and we're much more aware of risk in late modernity than we have been previously. That doesn't mean we're subject to less risks or more risks than we were. And of course not. In previous times there were far higher levels of childhood mortality, far more diseases, working life was far more dangerous, and our life expectation was far lower. But what we have today in late modernity is a far greater appreciation and understanding of it. And moreover, there again are formal systems for living this. So you have actuaries that calculate how long people will live. You have paying into your pension from a very early age. You've got things like life insurance. So we're constantly aware of risk, and we seek to mitigate risk. We seek to do things to try and prevent risk occurring to us. And we calculate it far more than we ever did before. So there's three ideas of Giddens. I want to turn now to a guy called John Thompson, who's also another professor of sociology. He works at the University of Cambridge. So he's another influential sociologist, and his work, he focuses upon culture and the media. And in particular, he's examined the relationship of media with contemporary ideologies and how the media function in late modern societies, the impact of digital media on culture and society, and political communication. So what Thompson did, he sought to develop a number of Giddens' ideas and apply these ideas to the media. I've got a couple of Thompson's books here. There's one there called Ideology and Modern Culture, which I read when I was an undergraduate, and another one which is called Media and Modernity, and this is the main text that I'm going to be referring to. It was first published in 1995, and it's a very insightful book. However, he was writing this really before the advent of the internet proper, and although he skirts around it and just drawn it slightly, the internet has changed a number of things. Anyway, so let me go on to about Thompson's ideas. So he sought to apply a number of Giddens' ideas to the media. So first off, he challenges the idea of the mass media. And he says, in fact, there are no mass effects of media. Media don't just singly impose a single idea on many people at once, because we all receive the media differently. We all have different experiences, different biographies, and when we watch something, we all bring something slightly different to it. So although we all do sort of like watch the same thing, we might be engaging in it in a slightly different manner. But what he does say is that those media industries can be understood as the modern institutions that Giddens talks about, which intercede into our lives, which penetrate into our lives. So the media industries play a part in how we understand and experience the world. And they give us the information to live in the modern world. He also said that, if you go back to Marx underestimated the symbolic power and refutes Marx's idea that it equates directly to cultural power. So if you remember what Marx was arguing about, the people that control the ownership of the means of production also control the ownership of the means of mental production, and he challenges that idea. And what he said was, our identities and our ways of thinking about stuff are appropriated from all sorts of bits all around the world, from watching television, from understanding things through the media, and we pull in these various bits and we weave them into our identity. However, he also recognised that corporate media now intersect with our lives far more, and our identity formation occurs not just through direct interaction with others, but through our engagement with the world through the media. So somehow the media has now got in the way of our experience of the world, and that plays a major part in how we think about identity and construct it. So these are two sociologists that work in the field of high or late modernity, and there are many others that do this. There's people like Zygmunt Bauman and a number of others who look at this area as well. But I've just focused on two here. I'm going to move on a little bit now to, well, a slightly different approach. Oh no, I'm not. What I'm going to do is evaluate them. So let's have a quick look at an evaluation of Giddens and Thompson's ideas. And when we talk about the pros of this, well, for starters, they allow us to look at the intersection of structure and individual action, and how globalization is brought to us through the media. And because of their approach is based on a contemporary understanding of modernity, it perhaps better reflects the issues of our time than some of the preceding theories. But what also it does, it offers a progressive view of analysis of the media and globalization. It offers a way in which we can critique the media without adopting an overtly Marxist agenda. Now, in terms of the negatives of their views, well, their view is based on the experience of the West primarily, and Giddens has what some say is an unduly benign, an unduly positive view of globalization. So for Giddens, globalization is a good thing. It frees up people. It allows us to buy things from all over the world, and it allows money to move around. Now, there's a lot of losers to globalization as well. People didn't benefit from it in many ways. Local cultures have been damaged by globalization. So although Giddens is positive, there's a strong critique of Giddens that says he didn't really see globalization in its true sense. Giddens has also been accused of advocating a Western or Eurocentric view of modernity. So he's looking at it from our perspective rather than looking at it from the position of people that haven't had such a good experience of it. And he has what's termed a cosmopolitan view. So what Giddens argues is essentially that we need to respect difference between people. And he draws on a long tradition of cosmopolitan thought that goes way back. And here the people argue that in fact there are no differences between people, and it's all about us respecting our different ways of viewing and being in the world. But if you want to think about how you can understand the world, you've got to see all people as part of a singular entity, rather than thinking of us in terms of different nations and groups and races and classes like that. He sought a unifying agenda. But the trouble is, in the 21st century, traditions reasserted itself. And you've got lots of nationalist movements emerging, you've got lots of more racist movements emerging out, you've got people reverting back to these older systems of identification, opposed to Giddens' view, which is say, we've got to think of ourselves as one people spread across the world. And Giddens would be very concerned by Brexit, because Brexit is about a group of people drawing a line and saying we're not part of those others anymore. And similarly with America under Trump, drawing a line and saying we're not looking after the world anymore. So although Giddens was very astute, a lot of people are saying, well, he doesn't actually tie up with how people are thinking today. And moreover, the media itself don't seem to be a force for liberal tolerance. So the media are there and they're not doing good. They're helping stir up Brexit, they're helping stir up conflict and so on. Giddens also had assumptions about capitalism and now look slightly questionable. I was talking a little while ago about his third way, and it doesn't seem to be delivering the benefits it promised. And some would argue that the whole capitalist project is looking a little bit creaky now. It doesn't look as stable as it was back in the 1990s. Okay, well, let me move on to two other theorists. So here I want to talk about the work of Fredrick, Jameson and Baudrillard. And these two are both what are called postmodernists. So this is an alternative view to late modernity, is that the period of modernity has actually come to an end, and we now live in the postmodern time, the period after modernity. So in the 1980s, critics, artists and theorists began to use the term postmodernism to refer to a new mood in culture, literature, art, architecture, politics and the media. The modern era was one of grand narratives, of big ideas that unite people, of big truths. Medicine was going to cure the world. Capitalism was going to offer a way forward for everyone. And what communism would offer this, or fascism would offer this. Instead, in postmodernism, we get cultural relativism. We don't believe that one theory is any more truth than anything else. And we begin to have a disbelief in those larger systems, those larger ways of understanding the world. We have what one theorist, a guy called Lyotard, called an incredulity towards meta-narratives. And what that phrase means is we don't believe in the big stories that explain everything anymore. Instead we turn to different forms of truth. So to give an example, in medicine, many people get sick and they do go to the doctor, but they also go and go to acupuncture classes, or they go and take on other things. So there's different ways of understanding the world. Postmodernism is a recognition that there are multiple truths out there. So you've got Fredrick Jameson. He's one of the key theorists of postmodernism. He was an American literary critic and a Marxist, and his work reflects a primarily US experience. And he offered a challenge to the existing postmodernist interpretation of culture, and he developed influential ideas about pastiche. Now pastiche is when you bring together different elements of different texts and construct them in a new way. So it's a bit like when you sometimes get a YouTube clip that brings together one bit from something else and it mashes it up with something else. That's a pastiche. And what he argued is that that was the postmodern equivalent to parody. And parody is an older literary form where you pretend to be something else to throw it into relief, to show how it's different from what you are. And it's quite often used in comedy. Pastiche is slightly different to parody, so pastiche is the combining of different ideas. So his key work was the 1991 text Postmodernism, the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. And in this work he develops several key ideas, and he borrows ideas from others. So first off, he refers to postmodern culture as a mode of experience. And it reflects the conditions of late capitalism our grasp of the fixed certainties and truth weakens, and the meta-narratives of science, religion, political ideologies and the dominant belief systems are eroded, and even our experience of time, space and distance is no longer certain. So architecture changes to kind of reflect the changes that are going on in our life. Now, in the modern era, some areas of art and culture remained uncommercialised, remained unattacked by financial pressures, and were allowed to remain that way. However, in the postmodern era, all art, culture and media is commodified. It loses its aura. It loses its idea that somehow it's more pure than other more commercial forms of expression. And more finally, for Jameson, he argued that memory is mediated. When we think about something, our experience of it is often intersected with the media, and people often understand things through their media experience of it. So if you look at the major events over the past 30 years, things that have occurred in our lives, and it might be slightly before your time, but in 9/11 there was the attack on America. Many people experienced that almost as a personal thing, but they weren't anywhere near it. They watched the TV scenes, and the TV set the agenda for so on. And all these big events that go on in our lives are mediated to us, and therefore they intersect with our memory of them. Okay, so that's Jameson, but I also want to talk about another person, a guy called Jean Baudrillard, who was a prolific French cultural theorist of the media and a commentator on popular culture. He was very influential in studies of postmodern culture. Indeed, if you've seen the film The Matrix, there's a little reference to him in the start of it, where Neo is hiding something, and he opens a copy of Baudrillard's book. Unfortunately, The Matrix completely misunderstood Baudrillard and got it wrong. But anyway, his work's been very provocative, and he's often been described as an agent provocateur. He says things that are slightly more than he could substantiate with evidence, just to win an argument. So he pushes the boundaries, he constantly tries to upset people, to make them think about things. And the key aspect of his work is on the sign. And if you remember back in the first year, we talked about how signs are made up by signifiers, signified and a reference, if you think back to your first year modules there. So the key aspect of work is on the sign and how it's central to understanding power relationships. So he develops lots of ideas about the media. And he starts off by critiquing Marxist political economy. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about Marx's ideas on political economy. And he was saying Marx's ideas were wrong. And instead, things have much more meaning than just their use value. They are signs as well and have a symbolic value. So if I look back, sort of like a Marxist interpretation, you can see my watch here. Well, a Marxist reading of a political economic reading of my watch would be, it's a device that allows me to tell the time so I can go to the correct place, so I can do labour or I can do my personal life. It allows me to govern myself. Now what Baudrillard's saying is, yeah, that's all true, but also what a watch does, it shows my wealth. So this is a rotary watch. It isn't terribly expensive, but it's quite nice. I got it for my birthday last year, and I chose it and stuff. So it has symbolic value to me, as well as a purely use value. So the use value allows me to tell the time, but the symbolic value is it was a gift from my family, and it's a nice brand and things like that. So brands and things like that have far more symbolic value than the use value. So when you buy a particular brand of clothing, when you go off and you spend a bit more money, you'd say, well, I'm not just wearing a shirt to keep warm, I'm wearing a shirt to show my affluence or to show my coolness or something else. So he said Marx didn't get this. Marx didn't understand this importance about the signs of things. And what Marx says, he never goes far enough. Instead, all Marx wants to do is to change the economic system that's underlying a cultural system. If you remember, he wants to change the base and move away from the capitalist system to the communist system. The real problem of oppression in our lives is not the economic system, but it's the symbols in our day-to-day lives. They are what are used to keep us enslaved. So what Baudrillard is saying is we've got to change the symbols of our life. Marx never went far enough. He only wanted to change the economic system. We've got to change the culture as well. And the third aspect of Baudrillard's work, well, he sought to develop a number of two sort of interrelated terms, and he put forward the idea of hyperreality, which is the process of highly accelerated semiosis. Now, this draws upon an idea we introduced to you in the first year. And semiosis is how things change their meaning, how signs become new meaning. And when you think of a word, it changes meaning over time. And what he's arguing about is that in postmodernity, this changing of signs' meaning accelerates, and it becomes faster and faster and faster. And it gets to the point where it moves away completely from the original meaning of the word or the sign. And here you get to something called the simulacrum. This is an alternative way of thinking about how we live in the modern world. And the simulacrum is the world of science we live in. Now, what he argues is the simulacrum has not hidden the world, as Althusser would be arguing, if you remember back to our discussion the other week about there being a false reality there. What he says is it's not a false reality, it's just a different reality, and it has replaced the world we live in, the real world, for a world of science. So the world we live in is a simulacrum, and that's where we live, and that's slightly different to the material world, but that's even more real, it's hyper-real, it's taken on this new essence. And this is where they went wrong in the Matrix, because they were still arguing that there was a real world somewhere out there, and we live in a fake world. And what Baudrillard's saying is, there is no real world. We only live in this fake world of signs and images anymore. There is no reality upon which to base things. Okay, so let's look at the pros and cons of these guys. So, if you evaluate Jameson and Baudrillard, the pros are very much reflect the power of the consumer capitalists in the 1980s and the cultural norms of the time. The theory had a really good word, a verisimilitude for a lot of people. Verisimilitude means the appearance of truth. So if you say something has a high degree of verisimilitude, it looks like a true explanation. And different social theories have different amounts of verisimilitude to different people. So some people would think that theory has got a lot of verisimilitude for me, a lot of the appearance of truth for me. For others it may not do so. But for a lot of people in the 1980s, 1990s, Baudrillard's theories did seem to explain a lot. And he offered a new range of new ways of understanding cultural life that was quite different from the existing Marxist way. So it was like a Marxism plus. It was a way of understanding things with a Marxist framework, but with a new focus. And he introduced new modes of thinking and analytic tools for understanding cultural life and symbols and symbolic action. Now the trouble with this stuff, well, it's very much a macro level analysis with no real contribution to the idea of agencies. So as Giddens was talking about agency, here we're getting rid of that and we're going back to the structuralism and post-structuralism again. And indeed the agent was extinguished by the post-structural analysis of Baudrillard. He ends up getting rid of the idea of an individual actor. And there's no recognition of resistance by people to signs. Well, sometimes we reject a sign, we reject a media text, and we offer an alternative reading of it. That doesn't figure in Baudrillard's work. It was very much a reflection of consumer capital. It was an uncritical approach to certain ways of thinking. It was very much of its time. And not a lot of people are applying Baudrillard today. It seems to have lost its ability to explain things. So it's a theory without explanatory legs. It couldn't go on to explain things outside of its immediate situation. And in times of austerity and political uncertainty, the ones we live through today, maybe the model doesn't work as well. And perhaps today we see a turn away from the power of the sign back to the essentials of life. Well, that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture. Some of these are very tricky ideas, so have a look at the reading. And finally, please let me know if you like this kind of presentation or whether you'd like me to go back to the other type. Thanks so much.